Hey everyone, tonight we'll delve into a deeply unsettling phenomenon. One that starts with the quiet creak of a floorboard and ends with a chilling realization. The unseen roommate. Imagine you're alone in your apartment. A deep silence punctuated only by the distant hum of city life. But then you hear a soft scrape from the kitchen, a gentle sigh from the empty hallway. You rationalize it. Of course, the pipe's the wind, but what if a part of you knows better? What if you know with a cold certainty that you're not alone at all? The psychological horror of an unseen presence is far more terrifying than any phantom you could see. So you probably won't want to be alone after this. Before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, and we can be scared together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's unravel this chilling tale together. The chilling tale we're exploring today is a classic of the paranormal world, a haunting so subtle and pervasive it has driven people to the brink of sanity. It's the story of the unseen roommate, a presence that occupies a space but refuses to be seen. You've heard the urban legends, a doppelganger in the mirror, a shadow that mimics your movements, but this is different. This is a haunting that starts small, almost imperceptibly, and then slowly but surely, it begins to occupy every corner of your life. It starts with the feeling of not being alone. The kind of sensation that makes the hairs on your arms stand up, even when the air is still and warm. It's that primal, instinctive reaction we have to being watched. You're sitting on the couch, watching a movie, and you suddenly feel a weight on the cushion beside you. A brief depression, as if someone has just sat down. Of course you glance over. Nothing. But the feeling persists, a phantom weight that you can't shake. This type of haunting preys on a very specific psychological vulnerability. We are creatures of habit, of routine. When those routines are subtly disrupted by something that shouldn't be there, our minds struggle to cope. Think about the classic real ghost stories of the 19th century, often attributed to the hysteria of the time. There was a well-documented phenomenon known as poltergeist hysteria, where people, typically women in constrained social situations, would manifest a sort of psychokinetic energy that would cause objects to move. Psychologists of the day tried to explain it as a release of subconscious energy, a desperate plea for attention from an unseen source. But what if the source wasn't subconscious at all? What if it was something else entirely? A forgotten urban legend says that these poltergeists were not human-generated energy but something else. A symbiotic entity that fed off the suppressed emotion and manifested itself in the world by moving things, making noises. A fascinating theory, though perhaps just a spooky tale, and that's the unsettling truth about the unseen roommate. It starts with small changes. You leave your keys on the counter, but find them later on the floor. Here. You set your glasses down by the bed, only to find them on the opposite end of the room. You rationalize it, of course. You're tired, forgetful. We all misplace things, right? But what if those things were never misplaced? What if they were? Moved. One story tells of a man who worked from home and started to notice strange things happening to his computer. Files would be moved, bookmarks would be added, and one day he found a bizarre, nonsensical document full of random characters saved to his desktop. He dismissed it as a glitch, maybe a virus, till he realized the file had been saved at 4 a.m. a time, when he was sound asleep. That small, quirky detail, the idea of a ghost that messes with your computer files, is a perfect example of how these stories adapt to modern life. The most chilling aspect of this particular phenomenon is its deliberate nature. It isn't a random occurrence. It's a slow, methodical invasion. It's a game of cat and mouse, but you're the mouse and you don't even know you're playing. The unseen roommate is an entity that wants you to know it's there. It wants to be acknowledged, and it will do anything to get your attention. It's not a screaming phantom or a rattling chain. It's a whisper on the edge of hearing, a shadow that disappears as soon as you turn your head. A persistent sense of dread that clings to you like a second skin. It's the moment you stop doubting yourself and start to fear what else is in the room. But the question remained, what did the unseen roommate want? Was it a lonely spirit looking for companionship or something more sinister, something with a malicious intent? Was it just a trick of the mind or a genuine supernatural presence? And if it was real, what would happen when it finally decided to show itself? What would be the horrifying conclusion to this slow-burn torment? The story begins with a woman named Chloe, a graduate student, who, like many of us, was just trying to find an affordable place to live in a crowded city. She found a perfect apartment, an old Victorian with high ceilings and beautiful, creaky hardwood floors, just a few blocks from her university library. The landlord was a kindly old man who seemed to have 1,000 stories, and the price was unbelievably low. The only quirk, the landlord warned her that the apartment had been vacant for years, not because of any supernatural reason, he insisted, but because a previous tenant had left in a hurry after a bad breakup, leaving behind some odd bits and pieces of furniture. A peculiar, slightly warped wooden rocking chair in the corner of the living room, a dusty old grandfather clock that didn't work, and a single, faded portrait of a stoic-looking woman hanging in the hallway. It was quirky, a little spooky, but nothing to be afraid of, or so she thought. The first few weeks were peaceful. Chloe settled into a routine of studying, working late, and enjoying the silence of her new home. She liked the solitude. She found it easier to focus without the distractions of roommates. The silence, however, was about to be broken. It started with a sound, so faint she almost dismissed it, a soft, rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from the wall in her bedroom, a sound that she at first attributed to mice or the settling of the old house. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was a scratching that sounded like it was counting, a slow, methodical tock that would go on for precisely 7 beats before stopping. She'd put her ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint the source, but the moment she got close, it would cease. This is a classic trope in Chilling Encounters and is often linked to the folklore of house goblins or knockers in Welsh and Cornish mining traditions, little spirits that were said to live in the walls of homes and mines. Miners would often hear them tapping on the walls and believe that they were a good omen, a warning of an impending collapse or a direction to a new vein of ore. A bizarre detail in some of these stories, however, is that the knockers would only tap in specific prime numbers, almost as if they were trying to communicate a mathematical sequence. This is a very specific kind of haunting, one that feels purposeful and intellectual, not just a random noise. Chloe began to notice other small, bizarre details. The grandfather clock, which she had been told was broken, would occasionally chime a single, muffled bong at exactly 3 a.m., a sound that would jolt her awake from a dead sleep. She started to check the time on her phone, and every time, without fail, it was exactly 3 a.m. It was never a full chime. It's never the sound of the clock striking 3 times, but a single, hollow, echoing sound that felt like it was coming from inside the room itself, not from the clock. This quirky detail, a supposedly broken object that occasionally shows a flicker of life, was deeply unsettling because it defied all logic and expectation. The clock was clearly non-functional, but something was making it sound. But the most unsettling discovery was yet to come. She was in the kitchen, making tea, and she noticed that the refrigerator door was slightly ajar. She distinctly remembered closing it after getting out the milk. She shook her head, muttering about her own forgetfulness, and pushed the door shut. But the next day, the same thing happened, and the day after that. It was always just a small crack, a tiny opening that let out a whisper of cold air. It wasn't enough to spoil her food, but it was enough to be unsettling. It was a silent, persistent reminder that she wasn't alone. It was a whisper in the quiet of her own home, the feeling of being watched, intensified. She'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of her eye, a flicker of shadow in the hallway, but when she turned, there was nothing. The chilling question remained. Why was this happening to her? Was it a residual haunting, a loop of a past event, or was it something more, something intelligent and aware of her presence, something that was actively trying to get her attention? What was this unseen force trying to tell her? And what would happen when it succeeded? The unsettling experiences escalated, moving from mere sounds to a profound sense of violation. The mundane, everyday objects in Chloe's home began to reflect a hidden, unseen life. She would find her favorite mug, the one with the faded picture of a cat, not on the drying rack where she left it, but in the sink, as if it had been used by someone else and rinsed. Her shoes, neatly arranged by the door, would be slightly scuffed or turned at an unnatural angle. It was as if someone was walking through her space, not with malicious intent, but with a casual disregard for her presence. a chilling indication that they were completely comfortable and at home. This is a common element in real ghost stories that involve residential hauntings, the spirit acting as if it is still a living inhabitant. A historical fact that is particularly eerie here relates to the Victorian-era-esque belief in spirit photography. Back then, mediums would often claim that a blurry, transparent figure in a photograph was the spirit of a deceased loved one, captured in a moment of subtle intrusion into the world of the living. The photos were often hoaxes, but the public's willingness to believe in them speaks to a deep, human fascination with the idea that the unseen world is just a little bit out of sync with our own, constantly overlapping. Chloe's sense of routine began to unravel. Her sleep became restless, haunted by the muffled sound of footsteps moving through the hallway at night, a soft and deliberate padding that was never loud enough to be certain of. She would lie awake, rigid with fear, listening for the sound to stop, but it never did. It would simply fade into the static of her own breathing and the soft hum of the fan. The grandfather clock would continue to chime a single solitary bong at exactly 3 a.m., a sound that she now dreaded more than anything. It was a macabre alarm clock, a signal that she was not alone, that her solitude was an illusion. The feeling was a creeping coldness that was not a physical chill, but a psychological one, a feeling of dread that radiated from the empty space beside her in bed. One afternoon, while she was sitting at her desk studying, a book from the shelf directly behind her slid off and fell to the floor with a quiet thud. It wasn't a large or heavy book, just a paperback copy of an old mystery novel. But the movement was so deliberate and sudden that it made her jump. She picked it up, her heart pounding, and put it back on the shelf. She told herself it was just a loose shelf, a fluke. But as she sat back down, she noticed something she hadn't before. On the cover of the book, in a barely perceptible indentation, was a single, clean fingerprint, the kind you get from pressing a thumb firmly into a dusty surface. It was not her fingerprint. This bizarre detail, a ghost with a fingerprint, defied all the classic rules of ghostly encounters. How could a spirit, a non-physical entity, leave a physical mark on an object? It was an act of deliberate physical malice, a way of saying, I am here, and I can touch your world. Her academic studies, ironically, offered a chilling parallel. She was researching the history of urban architecture and came across a local legend about a hidden ghost floor in many old buildings, a space that was deliberately omitted from floor plans and records, a space meant to trap something. It was a bizarre piece of architectural folklore, and the fact that her own apartment seemed to have its own unseen occupant made her blood run cold. She began to wonder if her apartment was one of these places, a house with a secret, and if the unseen roommate wasn't just a presence, but a trapped one, a ghost who was condemned to occupy a space that was not theirs. This strange connection between a historical fact and her personal experience only deepened the sense of unexplained mysteries and growing dread. The question gnawed at her. Was this being simply trying to communicate? Or was it a prisoner of her home? A prisoner that was growing increasingly resentful of her presence? What would it do when its subtle game of psychological terror was no longer enough to get her attention? And how long could she endure this slow, methodical descent into madness before something gave either her sanity or the unseen presence's patience? The psychological torment moved from subtle, almost imperceptible disruptions to direct personal violations of Chloe's space. It was no longer about misplaced keys or a tilted shoe. It was a deliberate and chilling interaction with her personal belongings, as if the unseen roommate was trying to wear her life like a costume. One evening, she came home from the library and found her pajamas, which she had left neatly folded on her bed, strewn across the floor of her room. The clothes were not just disheveled. They were arranged in a way that suggested someone had stepped on them and then walked away. A silent trail of fabric leading toward the closet. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was a violation so intimate and personal that it was 1,000 times more terrifying than any loud bang or ghostly whisper. This is where the haunting transitions from a mere inconvenience to a deeply unsettling, unexplained mystery. The line between her own forgetfulness and the actions of a malevolent presence blurred to the point of invisibility. The gaslighting, an insidious form of psychological manipulation, was now the main weapon of the unseen roommate. She would find her laptop open to a strange website she'd never visited. a page with an old monochrome photograph of a forgotten street corner in the city. The image was grainy, and at the very edge of the frame, a blurry figure seemed to be watching. A figure that looked remarkably like the stoic-looking woman in the portrait from the hallway. This eerie connection, a ghostly face that appeared in two separate places, was a horrifying new piece of the puzzle. This particular detail is a subtle but powerful callback to the ghost lore of the early 20th century, where apparitions were often said to be tied to specific personal objects or photographs, and would show themselves only to those who dared to look into their past. The sense of an invasive presence became almost unbearable. She started to hear her own name whispered in her ear when she was alone in the shower, the sound of her name being exhaled like a cold breath on the back of her neck. The voice was soft and feminine, and it carried a tone of immense sadness, but also a deep, lingering resentment. The old grandfather clock now not only chimed at 3 a.m., but she also started to hear the distinct ticking tock of its pendulum. When the clock was completely still and silent, the sound would start suddenly, a frantic mechanical beat in the dead of the night, and then stop just as abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. This bizarre detail, the ghost of a clock's sound, was a chilling new layer to the psychological torment. It was a sound that shouldn't be possible, and its presence was a definitive sign that her mind was not playing tricks on her. Her research at the library took on a new, grim significance. She stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping from the 1920s that mentioned a tragedy in her building. A young woman named Elisa, a newlywed who lived in the same apartment, had committed suicide after a devastating illness. The article was short and clinical, but it mentioned a single, chilling detail. She had left a note that read, "He's here, and he won't let me go." The article didn't mention who he was. And the chilling part of the story was that the legend of the building's haunting was not about Eliza, but about him, an unseen figure who had tormented her until she couldn't take it anymore. The terrifying thought occurred to her. What if the entity in her apartment wasn't Eliza, but the same he who had driven her to despair? What if she wasn't living with a lonely ghost, but a predator? The haunting was a terrifying game of psychological warfare, and Chloe was losing. She started to leave notes for herself, little pieces of paper with a single word on them: keys, shoes, pajamas. She would check them obsessively, only to find the objects moved, the notes torn up, a quiet, defiant protest from her unseen companion. The chilling question lingered. What would happen when the unseen roommate-esque game turned from psychological torture to direct physical contact? And what did it want from her now that it had her full and undivided attention? The escalating horror of the unseen roommate reached a new, terrifying peak when the psychological manipulation began to affect Chloe's physical world in a direct and undeniable way. It started subtly, as these things always do. She would wake up in the middle of the night to a soft, rhythmic tapping sound, not from the walls this time, but from her bedroom window. She would look out, but there was nothing there, just the quiet street below. But one morning she woke to find a single, tiny, perfectly formed handprint on the outside of her window. A print that looked as if a child had pressed its hand against the glass. It was so small, so impossibly clear, that her heart hammered in her chest. This bizarre and poignant detail, ghost leaving a child's handprint, was more unsettling than any loud bang or cold spot, as it suggested a profound sadness and an almost desperate need for contact. Her research at the library had now become a morbid obsession. She learned about the history of her building and the tragic tale of Eliza. It was said that Eliza's husband, a man named Thomas, was a controlling and possessive man, a man who saw his wife as a possession, not a person. According to local paranormal lore, his jealousy was so intense that when Elisa died, his spirit became tethered to the apartment, forever trying to possess the women who lived there. The ghost in her apartment wasn't just a random spirit, it was a jealous, malevolent entity, a possessive predator that was playing a long and terrifying game. A forgotten local legend spoke of a phantom mirror in the building, a large, ornate mirror that was said to show not your reflection, but the person you truly belonged to. The legend claimed that Thomas, in a final act of control, had willed his spirit into the mirror, so he could always watch over his property. Chloe found herself becoming a prisoner in her own home. She began to notice a faint phantom scent in the air, the smell of an old, heavy perfume, the kind that might have been popular in the 1920s. It was a sweet, cloying scent that would come and go. But when it was there, it was a suffocating reminder that she was not alone. The grandfather clock, now a symbol of her torment, began to tick at all hours of the day, a manic, frantic rhythm that would suddenly stop, leaving behind a silence that was more unnerving than the sound itself. It was as if the ghost was deliberately toying with her, a game of psychological cat and mouse that was slowly but surely driving her to the edge of sanity. One night, she decided to confront the unseen roommate. She stood in the middle of the living room, her voice trembling but firm, and said, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The silence that followed was so thick and heavy it felt like a physical presence. But then she heard it. A soft, chilling whisper, so close to her ear it sent shivers down her spine. The voice was distorted, but she could make out a few words. It said, "You, will, The voice was not Eliza's. It was a man's voice, raspy and filled with a cold, possessive rage. This terrifying moment was the point of no return. It was no longer a game of psychological warfare. It was a direct threat. The chilling encounter was a definitive statement of intent. And she knew then that she was trapped, that this ghost was not going to leave. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. The question remained, what did the unseen roommate mean when he said she would stay? Was he simply trying to keep her in the apartment, or did he have a more sinister, more permanent plan for her? What would he do to her when he finally got what he wanted, and how far was he willing to go to make her his permanent possession? The chilling encounter with the possessive whisper from the unseen roommate left Chloe in a state of terror. The psychological game had ended, and the direct threat had begun. She spent the next few days in a haze of fear, her every move watched, her every action scrutinized. The feeling of being observed was no longer a vague sense of unease. It was a palpable presence, a suffocating weight in the room. She started to see things at the periphery of her vision, not just shadows, but glimpses of a figure, a tall, gaunt man with a dark suit and a long, unsettlingly straight back. The figure would disappear the moment she turned to look, but the image was seared into her mind, a horrifying premonition of what was to come. This is a classic aspect of unexplained phenomena, where the subconscious mind, anticipating a threat, begins to manifest it in the form of fleeting, visual hallucinations. Her research revealed a fascinating and morbid local legend from the 1920s about mirror ghosts. It was believed that a person who died with an intense emotional attachment to a place or object could have their spirit trapped within a reflective surface, doomed to watch the world go by without being able to interact with it. The ghost would be a prisoner in its own reflection, and its only way to communicate with the living would be to manifest itself in other reflective surfaces. A trick of the light, a flicker of movement in a window pane. A specific, quirky detail of this legend was that the ghost would sometimes try to communicate through a mirror by making a faint, scratching sound on the glass, almost like a fingernail dragging across a chalkboard. This detail, of course, was particularly terrifying to Chloe, who had a large, antique mirror in her bedroom that she now feared looking into. She began to cover all the reflective surfaces in her apartment, a desperate and futile attempt to hide from the possessive eyes of the unseen roommate. The haunting intensified, becoming more audacious and physically invasive. One night, as she lay in bed, she felt a cold pressure on her chest, a weight that was so heavy she couldn't breathe. Her eyes shot open and she saw nothing, but the pressure was there, a crushing, suffocating weight that was slowly pushing the air out of her lungs. It was a classic case of what is now known as sleep paralysis, a state where the mind is awake, but the body is still asleep, a terrifying moment of being completely aware but unable to move. But this was different. This was not a hallucination. It was a physical presence. The weight was cold, and she could feel it shifting on her chest, as if a large, heavy person was sitting on her. And then she heard the whisper again, right beside her ear. "You can't leave," it hissed. "You are mine now." Her mind, in a desperate attempt to find a rational explanation, grasped at a little-known historical fact. The old Victorian buildings in her city were often built with hidden servants' passages, small, claustrophobic spaces behind the walls that allowed staff to move between rooms without being seen. These passages were often sealed up in later years, but the possibility that someone or something was living in her walls, moving freely through her home, was a horrifying thought. It made the unseen roommate an even more immediate, more physical threat. The chilling question now was not what the unseen roommate wanted, but what it was capable of. Its game had progressed from a quiet whisper to a physical assault, a possessive, terrifying act of violation. The question was, what was its endgame? Was it simply trying to scare her away? Or was it trying to do something far more sinister, something that would keep her in the apartment forever? And how would she ever be able to fight a ghost that was now a physical presence? The physical assault of the sleep paralysis incident left Chloe shattered, but also with a cold, desperate clarity. The unseen roommate wasn't a passive presence or a lost soul. It was an intelligent and malicious entity with a clear agenda. Driven by a primal need for survival, she began to take her first deliberate steps to fight back. Her strategy was simple: to learn everything she could about this entity and her apartment's haunted history. Believing that knowledge was the only weapon she had against an unseen foe, this is a common and often fatal mistake in chilling encounters, believing that rationality can defeat the supernatural. Her first act was to meticulously document everything. She bought a small digital recorder and a cheap security camera, setting them up to monitor her living room and bedroom while she was gone. A modern-day attempt to capture an old-world haunting. The idea was to have undeniable proof, a clear record of the events that were happening to her. Her research at the local historical society yielded a gruesome and often overlooked detail about the building. The apartment had been the site of a bizarre lovesickness epidemic in the 1920s, a strange psychological phenomenon where young women living in the building would become overwhelmingly depressed and withdrawn, often talking to themselves and losing their will to live. It was all dismissed as the stress of the time, but a curious detail in the archives mentioned a local folk remedy, a sympathetic mirror, a piece of glass that was said to absorb negative energy and reflect it back onto the source. The remedy was, of course, a sham, but the idea of a mirror being used to contain a malicious spirit was a fascinating and chilling historical fact. The unseen roommate, Thomas, as she now knew him, had clearly co-opted this belief for his own nefarious purposes, using his love of mirrors to trap not just himself, but others as well. The haunting, in turn, began to respond to her efforts. She would return from the library to find her security camera unplugged, her recorder turned off, the batteries removed and placed in a neat little pile on the table beside it. It was a silent, chilling act of defiance, a clear message that he knew what she was doing and that he would not be caught. One day, she found a single, broken shard of glass on her desk, a small, polished piece that reflected her distorted face back at her. This bizarre detail, the ghost breaking his own mirror to get to her, was a terrifying sign of his escalating rage. It was as if he was saying that he didn't need to hide behind a reflective surface anymore. He was now free to move in her world. The haunting culminated in a new, more horrifying form of torment. One night as she lay in bed, she felt a cold presence beside her. The bed shifted, the mattress compressing as if someone was climbing in beside her. The sheets rustled, and a cold hand, a phantom touch, brushed against her arm. She froze, a scream caught in her throat. She could feel the cold breath on her neck. And a low, guttural voice, a sound that was less a whisper and more a growl, said, "Don't look at me. Look at me. Don't look at me." The voice was a terrifying contradiction, a confused and tormented demand, a sign that the unseen roommate was not just a predator, but a deeply disturbed and insane being. The question remained, was this a trick to get her to look at something horrifying, or was it a desperate plea for her to not look at his true, terrifying form? The chilling question remained. What did the unseen roommate's strange command mean? Was he trying to show her something, or was he trying to trap her in a permanent state of psychological terror? What would happen when she finally gave in to his demand and looked at him, or what would happen if she didn't? The escalating violence of the unseen roommate left Chloe with a singular, terrifying reality. She could not stay, but she could not simply run. The entity had made it clear it would not let her leave. Her next logical step, therefore, was not to flee, but to seek help, to find an external expert who could validate her terrifying experiences and, more importantly, offer a solution beyond her own limited knowledge. She went online, not to a generic forum, but to a very specific and niche community of urban paranormal investigators. She was looking for someone who understood the psychological and physical nature of possessive hauntings. Someone who dealt not with residual energy, but with intelligent, malicious entities. This is a common narrative progression in chilling encounters, where the protagonist, having exhausted all rational options, turns to the occult or esoteric for answers, often with disastrous results. Her search led her to a woman named Dr. Lena Petrov, a reclusive but highly respected paranormal psychologist who specialized in what she called mimetic hauntings, entities that learn, adapt, and mimic the living to blend into the world. Dr. Petrov had a reputation for being skeptical of most ghost stories, but had a unique interest in those that exhibited a clear, intellectual progression, much like the one Chloe was experiencing. This unique detail about the ghost's adaptive nature added a new layer of horror. The unseen roommate wasn't just a trapped spirit. It was a ghost that was actively studying Chloe, learning her habits, and finding new ways to terrorize her. The chilling historical fact that Dr. Petrov often referenced was a little known. Folklore about house-wraith spirits that were said to be so envious of the living that they would slowly but surely absorb their energy and personalities. A spiritual parasite that would eventually replace its host, leaving the body an empty vessel. Chloe set up a virtual consultation, detailing her experiences in a shaky but methodical manner. Dr. Petrov listened patiently, a quiet and observant presence on the other end of the line. When Chloe finished, Dr. Petrov didn't offer sympathy or dismiss her. Instead, she asked a single, unnerving question. What did you hear when the voice told you to look at it? The question, which seemed to be a simple callback to Chloe's previous torment, is in fact a crucial detail. Dr. Petrov explained that these entities often communicate in paradoxes, in contradictory demands that are designed to confuse and terrify. The ghost telling her to look at me, don't look at me, was not a sign of confusion, but a clear, malevolent command designed to lure her into a state of panic where she might do something that would make her more vulnerable. The haunting, as if it knew she was reaching out for help, escalated its psychological warfare. Her phone would ring with no one on the other end. Her laptop would open to her emails, but every single email would be from an unknown sender. The subject line a single, cryptic phrase. I'm watching you. The refrigerator, which had been a source of minor inconvenience, now became a horrifying centerpiece. She would open it to find the milk carton turned backward, the expiration date facing the back of the fridge, a silent, meticulous act of defiance. This bizarre and meticulous detail, the ghost of her roommate being tidy in a frightening way, was a clear sign that the ghost was mocking her, that it was in full control and aware of her every action. The chilling question now was, what did Dr. Petrov know that she wasn't telling her? What was the true nature of these mimetic hauntings? And what was the ultimate consequence of the unseen roommate's game? And, most importantly, could Dr. Petrov help her? Or was this a battle she was doomed to lose alone? Dr. Petrov's consultation was a lifeline, but it also opened the door to a new, more terrifying understanding of her predicament. The unseen roommate was not a simple haunting. It was a mimetic entity, a ghost that was actively learning and adapting to her, using her own fears and habits against her. This is a crucial concept in paranormal research, the idea that a haunting isn't a static loop of residual energy, but a dynamic, intelligent force that grows and evolves. The doctor's next instruction was simple, yet unnerving. You must not acknowledge its presence directly. Do not speak to it. Do not react to it. It feeds on your fear, your attention. The more you react, the stronger it becomes. This was a direct contradiction to everything Chloe had been doing. And the chilling thought that her attempts to fight back had only made her more vulnerable was a bitter pill to swallow. Her return to the apartment was a terrifying exercise in emotional restraint. She walked through her home, a cold sweat on her brow, forcing herself to ignore the telltale signs of the unseen roommate. She saw her keys move from the counter to the floor, and she simply picked them up and put them back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt the cold breath on the back of her neck, and she forced herself to keep walking, to not turn and scream. The ghost, however, was not so easily thwarted. It moved from subtle psychological torment to a more overt, physically unsettling presence. The grandfather clock, which had been silent for days, began to chime. But this time, it chimed at random intervals, a loud, discordant bong that would jolt her from a dead sleep. This bizarre detail, the ghost of a clock going haywire, was a clear sign that the ghost was enraged by her lack of attention. It was desperate to get a reaction from her. Her research, now guided by Dr. Petrov, led her to a little-known historical fact about the building's previous owner, a man who was an avid collector of antique dolls. The owner, who had lived in the apartment just before the tragic Eliza, was rumored to have had a bizarre obsession with sympathetic dolls. Dolls that were said to be imbued with a part of their owner's soul, a practice rooted in a twisted form of voodoo. The legend claimed that the owner, in a desperate attempt to have a permanent companion, created a doll that was a perfect replica of himself, a miniature effigy that was now missing. The horrifying thought occurred to her. What if the unseen roommate was not a ghost, but a curse, an entity? That was not a trapped soul, but a mimic, a creation of a twisted mind that was now seeking a new host. The haunting escalated into a new, more personal realm. She would wake up to the sound of soft, feminine laughter coming from the hallway. A mocking, high-pitched giggle that seemed to be coming from the empty space. But when she forced herself to not react, to not get up, and investigate, the laughter would morph into a low, guttural growl, a sound that was a terrifying contradiction to the initial laughter, as if the ghost was frustrated and confused. This strange, macabre detailer ghost that could not only mimic sounds but also get angry when ignored was a clear sign that this was not a residual haunting. It was a psychological battle, a test of wills. The entity was a master manipulator, and its goal was to break her down, to make her react, to feed on her fear until there was nothing left. The chilling question remained: what would the unseen roommate do when its psychological tricks and its physical assaults failed to elicit a reaction? What would be its final, desperate act to make her acknowledge its presence? And how long could she endure this silent torment before she finally broke and gave in to its demands? The silence was a weapon, and the unseen roommate wielded it with terrifying precision. Chloe's refusal to react had clearly enraged it, and its psychological tactics had now shifted from overt displays of power to an insidious, chilling form of torment. It was no longer about loud bangs or physical assault. It was about the profound, suffocating silence that followed every small, unexplainable event. She would leave a light on in the hallway and return to find it off, but with no accompanying sound of a switch flipping. The grandfather clock would be completely silent. Its hands stopped at a random time, a motionless, mocking presence in the room. This eerie stillness was more unnerving than any noise, as it left her with no rational explanation, no sound to attribute to the wind or a settling house. Her research with Dr. Petrov, however, was beginning to yield a deeper understanding of the mimetic entity. The doctor explained that these ghosts, in their desperate need to be seen and acknowledged, would often latch on to a single, dominant emotion from their past host. In the case of the unseen roommate, Thomas, his emotion was a consuming and suffocating jealousy. He was not just a ghost haunting her. He was a manifestation of a powerful and corrosive emotion, a spiritual parasite that fed on the fear and isolation of its host. This bizarre detailer ghost that was an emotional echo was a chilling new piece of the puzzle. It explained why the haunting was so personal, so deeply unsettling. It was designed to exploit her own feelings of loneliness and fear, to make her feel as if she was losing her mind. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a little-known bit of folklore. From the 1800s, where sympathy sickness was a common diagnosis, a psychological malady that was attributed to living with a person who was suffering from a hidden emotional trauma. The unseen roommate was the emotional baggage of a long-dead, jealous man, and it was a sickness that was now infecting her. The haunting manifested in a new, more subtle and personal way. She would be standing at the kitchen counter, and she would feel a cold presence behind her, a sensation that was not a draft, but a cold, heavy hand on her shoulder. She would not turn, but the feeling would persist, and she would hear a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound of immense sadness and longing, as if the ghost was grieving its own existence. This macabre observation, the sound of a ghost sighing, was a deeply unsettling reminder that the entity was not a one-dimensional monster. It was a complex and tormented being, a possessive predator that was also deeply lonely. The chilling question now was, what was the true nature of the unseen roommate's jealousy? Is it jealous of her life, her freedom, her ability to leave the apartment? Or was its jealousy more personal, more sinister, an emotion directed at her? A living, breathing woman, a terrifying reflection of its past. And what would happen when the silent torment was no longer enough to get a reaction from her? How would a ghost that was powered by silence and emotional manipulation escalate its attack when it was no longer able to provoke her with its loud displays of power? The silence had become a battlefield, and the unseen roommate, in its frustration, had found a new way to torment Chloe, by invading her senses in the most personal and unnerving ways. It was a form of psychological torture that bypassed her mind's defenses and went straight to her primal instincts. One morning, as she was making her coffee, she noticed a faint coppery taste in her mouth, like old blood, even though she hadn't cut herself or bitten her tongue. The taste was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it would build a metallic, cloying presence that would linger long after the coffee was gone. This bizarre sensory detail was not something she could rationalize away. It was an undeniable physical manifestation of the haunting. It was a horrifying and personal intrusion, a way for the unseen roommate to say, "I am inside you." Her research with Dr. Petrov had revealed a chilling, little-known fact about unexplained phenomena. The doctor explained that some aggressive, intelligent hauntings, in a desperate attempt to break their host's will, would create what is known as a sensory echo, a phantom smell, taste, or sound that had no physical source. This was a unique and deeply disturbing detail. It was a ghost that could not only move things, but could also create an illusion in her mind that was so powerful it felt real. It was an advanced form of psychological manipulation, a sign that the unseen roommate was not just intelligent but was a master of its craft. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a terrifying local legend about a woman who had lived in the building in the 1920s and had gone insane after complaining of a constant phantom taste of something vile in her mouth. She was eventually institutionalized, and her case was attributed to mental illness. But the doctor believed she was simply the victim of a mimetic haunting. The haunting escalated in a new, more subtle way. She would be sitting at her desk, and a sudden, bone-deep coldness would envelop her, not a draft, but a chill that felt like it was coming from inside her body. A coldness that would radiate from her bones and leave her shivering, even when the room was warm. It was a macabre, visceral experience, and she knew it was the ghost. A silent and chilling reminder that it was a part of her now, a permanent and terrifying presence. The old grandfather clock, which had been a symbol of her torment, was now completely silent. Its hands stopped at 2:45, a specific chilling time that seemed to mock her. The clock was no longer a source of loud, jarring noise, but a silent, menacing presence. A constant reminder of the ghost's power and its control over her life. The chilling question now was, why 2:45? Was there something significant about that time? A forgotten tragedy or a bizarre ritual that took place in the apartment? And what was the true nature of this sensory echo? Was it just a psychological trick? Or was it a sign of something more sinister and physical that the ghost was planning? What would be the next step in its methodical, chilling game of psychological torment? And how could she possibly fight a ghost that was now able to invade her very senses? The terrifying sensory echo was a clear indication that the unseen roommate's psychological warfare was now entering a new and far more personal phase. The coppery taste of blood in her mouth was a constant, vile reminder that the ghost was not just in her home, but was in her, a part of her. The chilling historical fact that Dr. Petrov uncovered was a little known anecdote from the 19th century about a bizarre form of possession known as sympathetic hunger, where a ghost unable to eat or drink would create a phantom sense of hunger and thirst in the person it was haunting. This macabre and unique detail, ghosts that wanted to consume her food and drink through her, was a horrifying new layer of the paranormal. It was a parasite, an entity that wanted to feed on her life, to slowly but surely replace her. Her research now focused on the tragic history of Elisa, the woman who had lived in the apartment and died under mysterious circumstances. Chloe found an old brittle diary entry from a neighbor, a woman who had lived in the building in the 1920s. The entry, written in a spidery, faded script, spoke of Eliza's growing depression and her husband's strange possessive behavior. The diary mentioned a specific, bizarre detail. Thomas, Eliza's husband, had a peculiar habit of leaving single black feathers on her pillow every night, a silent, chilling gesture that was meant to symbolize his ownership of her. This strange and unsettling detail was a clear indication that Thomas was not just a possessive man, but a controlling and malevolent one. The diary entry also mentioned a forgotten ritual, a folk remedy, that was supposed to ground a malevolent spirit to trap it in a single physical object. The ritual involved a mirror, a single black feather, and a piece of the ghost's former home. The haunting, in turn, escalated. The coppery taste in her mouth was now accompanied by a faint, phantom hunger, a hollow, gnawing feeling in her stomach that no amount of food could satisfy. She would eat a full meal, but the hunger would remain a deep, abiding ache that was a constant and physical reminder of the unseen roommate's parasitic nature. She would open her refrigerator, and the food would look normal, but when she went to eat it, it would be tasteless, as if the ghost had siphoned the very flavor out of it. This bizarre detail, a ghost that saps the taste from food, was a truly horrifying new form of torment. It was a way for the ghost to not only invade her body, but to also deny her one of the simple pleasures of life, a constant reminder of its power over her. The chilling question now was, what was the true nature of the ritual described in the diary? Was it a legitimate way to trap the ghost, or was it a trap, a dangerous and terrifying game that would only make the situation worse? And what would happen to her when the unseen roommate had completely consumed her life, her senses, and her very being? What would be left of her when it was done? The horrifying revelation of sympathetic hunger and the parasitic nature of the unseen roommate was a turning point for Chloe. She knew now that this was not a simple haunting. It was a battle for her very essence, her life force. The ghost was not just a prisoner in her home. It was a spiritual predator that was slowly consuming her from the inside out. Her desperation led her to Dr. Petrov's next, and most terrifying, instruction: to find a way to make the ghost reveal its true nature. The doctor explained that these mimetic entities, in their attempts to mimic the living, will often leave behind a single, definitive trace of their true forma, single, unmimicked act that is the key to their defeat. This chilling detail was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the terrifying reality she was now living in. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was an obscure bit of folklore from the 1800s, where spirit hunters would use a simple repetitive sound to make a ghost reveal its true form, a sound so unnatural and jarring that it would break the ghost's carefully constructed illusion. Armed with this new knowledge, Chloe returned to her apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. She bought a small portable metronome and set it to a slow, steady, and deliberate beat. The sound, a mechanical, rhythmic talk, was an immediate affront to the silence that had been her tormentor. The haunting's response was swift and violent. The coppery taste in her mouth became overwhelming, a suffocating metallic flavor that made her gag. The phantom hunger became a gnawing, unbearable pain. The temperature in the room plummeted, and she could see her own breath in the air, a white, ephemeral cloud that was a terrifying contradiction to the warmth of her body. The grandfather clock, which had been motionless for days, began to chime, but not at a normal pace. It was a rapid, frantic, discordant sound, a violent cacophony of metal against metal, as if the ghost was screaming. And then she noticed the bizarre detail. A single black feather, the same kind mentioned in the diary, appeared on her desk, a silent, chilling taunt from the unseen roommate. It was not a physical feather, but a perfect, shadowy replica, two-dimensional image that was so real she could almost feel its soft, downy texture. This terrifying manifestation was a definitive sign that the ghost was enraged, that its carefully constructed illusion was breaking, and that it was now showing her its true forma, vengeful, possessive, and deeply malicious entity that was not just a ghost, but a curse. The haunting, in its final desperate act, began to manifest physically. She would see fleeting glimpses of a figure in the mirror, not the blurred image of the gaunt man, but a full, terrifyingly clear reflection of a skeletal figure with two hollow black eyes. The face was gaunt, the expression was one of pure, unadulterated rage, and the figure was slowly, deliberately raising its hand, its long, bony fingers reaching out to touch her reflection. The chilling question lingered. What would happen when the ghost finally touched her reflection? Was it trying to pull her into the mirror, to trap her in the same way it was trapped? Or was it a final, desperate attempt to possess her, to make her his permanent host? What would happen when its illusion finally broke, and she was forced to confront its true, terrifying form? The metronome's relentless ticking had become a defiant heartbeat in the apartment, constant methodical sound that was slowly chipping away at the unseen roommate's sanity. The haunting, in its final, desperate act of rage, had abandoned all pretense of being subtle. The coppery taste and phantom hunger were now a constant, nauseating presence, and the temperature in the apartment was unnaturally cold. A biting, bone-deep chill that no amount of clothing or blankets could ward off. This is where a haunting becomes a psychological and physical battle for survival, where the ghost is no longer a silent predator, but a shrieking, violent force. This is a common theme in real ghost stories, where the ghost, once it is found out, will retaliate with a vengeance. Her research with Dr. Petrov led to a chilling new revelation about the nature of Thomas's haunting. The doctor explained that possessive spirits, in their desperation to control the living, will often create a spiritual echo, a phantom sound or image that is not just a reflection of their past, but a projection of their emotional state. This chilling and unique detail explained the terrifying cacophony of the grandfather clock and the skeletal figure in the mirror. It was not just a ghost showing itself. It was an entity's emotional state, its rage and desperation being physically manifested in her home. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a little-known anecdote from the late 19th century about a whispering phantom in an asylum. A ghost that was said to drive its victims mad by creating a constant tormenting sound that was an echo of its own emotional pain. The haunting's final, desperate act was a direct assault on her sanity. One night as she lay in bed, she heard a sound that was not the metronome's ticking or the grandfather clock's chiming. It was a low, mournful, and heartbreaking sound, the sound of a woman crying. The sound was coming from the hallway, and it was so realistic, so filled with a profound sense of sadness and despair, that it made her heart ache. But then she heard a second voice, a low, guttural growl that was filled with a cold, possessive rage. It was the unseen roommate, Thomas, and he was arguing with the crying woman. She could hear him hissing, "You will stay. She belongs to me now." The voice of the crying woman, which she now recognized as Eliza, was a desperate plea. "No, please, don't do this to her." The conversation, a terrifying, macabre puppet show between two ghosts, was a bizarre and chilling detail that broke all the rules of paranormal encounters. It was a clear indication that the unseen roommate was not a simple, one-dimensional monster. He was a tormentor, a predator that was still holding his victim captive, even in the afterlife. The ghost in her apartment was not just a singular entity. It was a terrifyingly complex and dysfunctional couple, a ghost that was a possessive predator and a victim that was still trapped in his web of control. The chilling question now was, what was Eliza trying to tell her? Was she a protector, a warning, or was she just as helpless as Chloe was? And what would happen when Thomas finally won the battle, when he finally made her his permanent possession? The chilling realization that she was a witness to a posthumous domestic dispute was a terrifying new layer to the haunting. The screams and pleas of Eliza and the low, guttural threats of Thomas were no longer just a psychological torment. They were a horrifying theatrical performance designed to break her down. Chloe now understood the full scope of the unseen roommate's plan. He was trying to replace Eliza, to find a new woman to possess and control. He was a parasitic entity that fed on the loneliness and despair of the women who lived in the apartment, and he was now in the final stages of his plan. Her research with Dr. Petrov led to a final, desperate bit of folklore about spiritual transference. This chilling and unique detail suggested that a ghost could, in a final act of desperation, transfer its consciousness into a living host, essentially killing the host and taking over their body. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman who had, in the 19th century, suddenly adopted a new personality and began speaking in a strange, antiquated dialect, a change that was attributed to a sudden and horrifying spiritual possession. The haunting, in its final terrifying act, began to manifest physically. The air in the apartment became so thick and heavy that it was difficult to breathe. A cold wind, a silent, swirling vortex of icy air, would move through the rooms, but the doors and windows were all shut. The grandfather clock, which had been a symbol of the haunting, was now silent. Its hands stopped at the time of Eliza's death, but now it was glowing, a faint, pulsing red light that emanated from the clock's face, a silent, terrifying countdown. This bizarre and macabre detail, a clock glowing with malevolent energy, was a clear indication that the ghostess power had reached a new, terrifying peak. The ghost of Thomas, no longer hiding in the shadows, began to show itself to her. She would catch glimpses of him in the corners of her eyes, a tall, emaciated figure with a gaunt face and two hollow black eyes that radiated a cold, possessive rage. He would be standing in the hallway at the foot of her bed or in the kitchen, always watching, always waiting. But what was most terrifying was the sound. She would hear the soft, rhythmic sound of a pendulum swinging, a sound that was coming from inside her own head. It was the ghost's final, desperate act to possess her, to make her his permanent host. The chilling question now was, what would happen when the grandfather clock's pulsing light finally faded? Was it a countdown to her death, her possession, or something else entirely? And what could she do to fight a ghost that was now a part of her, a silent, rhythmic ticking in her own mind? The pendulum's tick-tock was no longer a sound in the room. It was a rhythmic pulse in her own skull, a terrifying oral hallucination that signified the unseen roommate's final desperate push for full possession. Chloe's world was collapsing. She was a woman teetering on the brink of sanity, her reality and the ghost's reality merging into a single, terrifying nightmare. Her only hope was Dr. Petrov. The doctor, sensing the urgency in Chloe's panicked calls, revealed the final and most habitual part of her plan, a ritual to ground the ghost, to trap it in a physical object, so that it could no longer torment the living. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was an obscure bit of folklore about bond traps, a grisly but effective method of trapping a malevolent spirit in an object, usually a mirror, by making it a permanent part of the ghost's existence. The ritual, she explained, was a one-way ticket. It would either work or it would fail with dire consequences. Chloe, desperate and out of options, began to prepare for the ritual. The air in the apartment was thick with a malevolent energy. The objects in her home were no longer just possessions. They were silent witnesses to the terrifying battle for her soul. The grandfather clock, its face a pulsating red light, was a horrifying countdown. The phantom hunger and the coppery taste in her mouth were a constant, nauseating presence. The whispers of Eliza and the threats of Thomas were a relentless cacophony of fear and despair. The ritual was simple, but terrifying. She had to place a personal object to something of her own inside the grandfather clock, the ghost's former prison, and then using her own blood as a binding agent. She had to make a final, deliberate plea to the ghost to leave her alone and return to its prison. The bizarre and chilling detail was that the ritual required her to use a mirror that had to be a part of the apartment's history. It was a terrifying, paradoxical request, as she knew that the ghost of Thomas was also tied to the mirrors in the apartment. The final act of her torment was a horrifying psychological manipulation. As she was preparing for the ritual, she heard Thomas's voice in her head, a low, menacing whisper that said, "You can't leave me. You will stay with me. You will love me." And then a sound that was so filled with a profound sense of sadness that it made her heart ache. It was the sound of a woman weeping, a quiet, mournful sound that was coming from the hallway. It was Eliza, and she was begging her to stop, to not go through with the ritual. "He'll get you," she whispered. "He'll take you, just like he took me." The chilling question now was Eliza trying to help her, to warn her, or was she just as helpless as Chloe was, a victim of a cruel and twisted game? And what would happen when she finally performed the ritual? Would she be able to trap the ghost, or would she become its permanent possession? The chilling plea from the ghost of Eliza had planted a seed of doubt in Chloe's mind. Was the ritual a trap? Was Thomas's possessive rage so profound that he would use his victim as a weapon against his next target? The whispers of Eliza, now a constant, mournful presence, were a terrifying counterpoint to the rhythmic pulse of Thomas's rage in her head. She was caught between two ghosts, one a possessive predator and the other a tormented victim, and her sanity was slowly but surely fraying. The haunting had now become a terrifying tug-of-war for her soul. This is a common and deeply unsettling aspect of unexplained mysteries, where the ghost is not a singular entity, but a complex and multifaceted presence. Her research with Dr. Petrov led to a chilling new revelation. The doctor, in her extensive work with mimetic hauntings, had come across a little-known fact about echoing trauma. She explained that when a person dies a violent or traumatic death, their emotional pain can become a permanent part of the environment, a spiritual echo that can be felt and experienced by the living. This horrifying and unique detail explained Eliza's presence. She wasn't a separate ghost. She was a part of the house's trauma, a psychic imprint of her despair that was being manipulated by Thomas to confuse and torment Chloe. This chilling observation was a new, terrifying layer to the haunting. It was a ghost that could not only mimic the living, but could also use the trauma of the dead as a weapon. The haunting, in its final, desperate act, began to escalate its psychological torment. She would hear the sound of a woman crying, a soft, mournful sound that was coming from the hallway. But when she would try to ignore it, the sound would morph into a low, guttural growl, and then into Thomas's voice, whispering, "She's mine. She will always be mine." The whispering was a terrifying, paradoxical sound, as it was both Eliza's despair and Thomas's possessive rage at the same time. It was a chilling manifestation of their shared trauma, a horrifying reminder that she was now a part of their twisted afterlife. The final stage of the haunting was a physical, visual hallucination. She would see the faint, translucent figure of Eliza in the hallway, her face contorted in a silent scream of agony. But as she watched, the figure would flicker, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she would see the gaunt, skeletal face of Thomas superimposed over Eliza's, a horrifying and macabre merging of the two ghosts. The grandfather clock's red glow intensified, a pulsating, malevolent light that was a final countdown to her demise. The chilling question now was the spiritual transference an act of possession, or a final, desperate act of destruction? What would happen when the grandfather clock's pulsing light finally went out? Would she be trapped, possessed, or something else entirely? The chilling reality of the spiritual transference, the terrifying possibility that she was now on a countdown to possession, had shattered Chloe's will to resist. She was an actor in a play she didn't write, a prisoner in a home she couldn't escape. The haunting, in its final desperate act, was now a constant, unrelenting assault on her sanity. The air in the apartment was heavy, with a cold, cloying presence. The grandfather clock's pulsing red light was a terrifying, silent heartbeat, a countdown to the moment of her demise. This is a common and deeply unsettling aspect of chilling encounters, where the ghost is no longer just a separate entity, but a part of your very being. Her research with Dr. Petrov had revealed a bizarre and unique detail about sympathetic possession. The doctor explained that when a spirit attempts to possess a host, it will often leave a physical mark on the body, a spiritual tattoo that is a visual manifestation of its control. This chilling detail was a terrifying new layer of the paranormal. It was a ghost that could not only manipulate her mind, but could also leave a permanent physical mark on her body. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman in the 1920s who was institutionalized for a severe case of paranoia. The doctors of the time had dismissed her claims, but her medical records had a single curious detail: a faint, pulsing red birthmark on her wrist that had not been there before she became ill. The haunting, in its final, terrifying act, began to manifest physically. Chloe would find herself doing things she didn't remember doing. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find herself standing in the hallway, staring at the old, faded portrait of the stoic-looking woman. She would find notes written in her own handwriting, but with a different, more archaic script. A chilling and macabre reminder that her body was no longer her own. And then a new, more terrifying manifestation appeared. As she lay in bed, she felt a cold presence beside her. A cold hand, a phantom touch, began to trace a faint pulsating line on her wrist. A line that was as cold as ice and as real as a physical touch. She did not dare to look, but she knew what it was. It was a spiritual tattoo, a permanent physical mark of the unseen roommate's control over her. It was a terrifying sign that the possession had already begun. The chilling question now was, what was the true nature of the spiritual tattoo? Was it a sign of possession, or was it a final, desperate warning from the unseen roommate's last victim? What would happen when the grandfather clock's red light finally went out? And how could she fight a ghost that was now a part of her, a silent, ticking time bomb in her own mind? The spiritual tattoo on her wrist was a horrifying, undeniable sign that the possession had already begun. The line was faint, but it pulsed with a low, malevolent glow, a physical tether to the unseen roommate's world. Chloe was no longer just a witness to the haunting. She was now a victim, her body and mind being slowly but surely consumed by a jealous and possessive entity. The haunting, in its final, terrifying act, had now shifted from psychological torment to a slow, methodical invasion. This is a common and deeply unsettling aspect of unexplained phenomena, where the ghost is no longer a separate entity, but a part of your very being. Her research with Dr. Petrov had revealed a chilling new detail about spiritual tattoos. The doctor explained that these tattoos were not just a mark of possession, but were a form of spiritual GPS. It's a way for the ghost to find its host, no matter where they were. This chilling and unique detail was a terrifying new layer of the paranormal. It was a ghost that could not only control her in the apartment, but could also follow her. A constant, unrelenting presence that she could never escape. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman who had fled her haunted home, but was found dead. A week later, her body marked with a single black feather, a symbol of the unseen roommate's control. The haunting, in its final, terrifying act, had now shifted to a direct physical assault on her sanity. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find herself in a new, unfamiliar room. The room was dark, but she could hear a low, rhythmic ticking sound. The room was filled with old, abandoned furniture, and in the corner, a dusty grandfather clock, at its hands stopped at 2:45. The room was not in her apartment. It was a spiritual antechamber, a terrifying holding space that the unseen roommate had created for her. This chilling and macabre detail, a ghost that could create a physical space, was a sign of its immense and terrifying power. And then, a new, more terrifying manifestation appeared. She would see the faint, translucent figure of Elisa in the room, her face contorted in a silent scream of agony. But as she watched, the figure would flicker, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she would see the gaunt, skeletal face of Thomas superimposed over Elisa's. A horrifying and macabre merging of the two ghosts. The grandfather clock's red glow intensified, a pulsating, malevolent light that was a final countdown to her demise. The chilling question now was, what was the true nature of the spiritual antechamber? Was it a holding space for her soul, or was it a final, desperate act of destruction? What would happen when the grandfather clock's red light finally went out? And how could she fight a ghost that had now trapped her in a spiritual prison? The spiritual antechamber was not a dream or a hallucination. It was a horrifying new reality. Chloe was a prisoner in a dimension created from the unseen roommate's malevolence. A dark, desolate space that was a terrifying reflection of his twisted mind. The air was cold and stagnant, filled with the scent of dust and decay. The grandfather clock in the corner was no longer just a ticking countdown. It was a portal, a pulsating red light that was the only connection between her world and the ghosts. This is the ultimate stage of a real ghost story, where the haunting transcends the physical world and becomes a complete, all-encompassing reality. Her research with Dr. Petrov had revealed a bizarre and unique detail about these spiritual antechambers. The doctor explained that these spaces are not permanent. They are created by a ghost's will and are maintained by its power. If the ghost is defeated, the antechamber will collapse, and the victim will be returned to the physical world. This chilling and unique detail was a terrifying new layer of the paranormal. It meant that her only way out was to fight the ghost directly. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a ghost hunter in the 19th century who had found himself trapped in a spiritual antechamber and had to defeat the ghost's physical form to escape. The hunter had used a mirror to trap the ghost, a symbolic act that would sever the ghost's connection to the physical world. The haunting, in its final, terrifying act, began to manifest physically. The ghost of Thomas, no longer hiding in the shadows, began to show itself to her. He was not a skeletal figure, but a tall, gaunt man in a dark, antiquated suit, his face a terrifying mix of possessive rage and profound despair. He was standing in the center of the room, his eyes too hollow, black pools that radiated a cold, malevolent energy. But he was not alone. The ghost of Eliza was there too, a translucent figure that was clinging to him, her face contorted in a silent scream of agony. She was a permanent part of his antechamber, a spiritual trophy of his final victory over her. The ghost of Thomas began to move towards her, his footsteps silent and deliberate. The only sound in the room being the low, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. He was a predator, a possessive entity that had finally caught his prey. He reached out his hand, and a cold, chilling wind, a silent vortex of icy air, began to swirl around her, a physical manifestation of his power. The chilling question now was, what was his endgame? Was he going to possess her, to trap her in his antechamber? Or was he going to do something more sinister, something that would destroy her in both the physical and the spiritual worlds? How could she fight a ghost that was now a part of her, a silent, ticking time bomb in her own mind? The cold, silent figure of Thomas advancing towards Chloe was the culmination of every terrifying encounter she had endured. The spiritual antechamber was his domain, and she was his new prize. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, and the grandfather clock's pulsing red light intensified with every step he took, a silent, terrifying drumbeat to her impending doom. This is the climax of any truly terrifying paranormal encounter. The moment where the hunter becomes the hunted, and the ghost's true power is revealed. Her research with Dr. Petrov, however, had given her a final, desperate card to play. The doctor, in her extensive work with spiritual antechambers, had discovered a bizarre and unique detail about their creation. She explained that these spaces are created from a single, powerful emotional memory of the ghost. If the victim can find the source of that memory and destroy it, the antechamber will collapse. The ghost will be pulled back into the physical world, weakened and vulnerable. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman who had used a piece of her haunted home to create a spiritual compass, a ritual that would point her to the source of the ghost's trauma. Chloe, in a final desperate act of defiance, used her own spiritual tattoo, the very symbol of her possession, as a compass. She closed her eyes and focused on the low, rhythmic ticking in her own mind, the ghost's internal clock. The ticking, which had been a symbol of her torment, was now her only guide. She followed the sound, not with her ears, but with her mind. And she was led to a single object in the spiritual antechamber. It was an old, antique mirror, its frame ornate and tarnished. A mirror that was a perfect replica of the one in her bedroom. The mirror was not just an object, it was a spiritual tether, a direct connection to Thomas's past. The ghost of Thomas, sensing her intent, let out a low, guttural growl of pure, unadulterated rage. He quickened his pace, his cold, possessive energy radiating from him in waves. He was no longer a silent predator. He was a violent, enraged monster that was determined to keep her trapped in his antechamber forever. But Chloe was not alone. The ghost of Eliza, who had been a silent, helpless witness, began to cry out, not in a whisper, but in a clear, desperate scream of warning. "Look at the mirror. Don't look at him. Look at the mirror." The chilling question now was, what was in the mirror? Was it the source of his pain, the key to his defeat, or was it a final, desperate trap designed to make her look away from the only chance she had? What would happen when she finally looked into the mirror, and what terrifying truth would it reveal about the unseen roommate's past? The final confrontation had arrived. Chloe was standing in the spiritual antechamber, the ghost of Thomas advancing towards her, and the frantic, echoing screams of Eliza guiding her towards the mirror. The air was thick with a palpable tension, and the grandfather clock's red light pulsed with a menacing, hypnotic rhythm. This is the ultimate crucible of a chilling encounter, where the protagonist, stripped of all defenses, must face the source of their fear head-on. Her research with Dr. Petrov had given her a chilling and unique detail about these spiritual mirrors. The doctor explained that these mirrors are not just reflective surfaces. They're spiritual portals, a direct window into a ghost's soul. The mirror she was looking at was the key to defeating the unseen roommate, but it was also a terrifying gamble. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman who had used a mirror to trap a ghost, but in doing so had also trapped a part of her own soul, a sacrifice that was necessary to defeat the malevolent entity. With Thomas now just feet away, his cold, possessive energy radiating from him in waves, Chloe focused on the mirror. The surface was tarnished and dusty, but as she looked into it, the dust seemed to clear, and she saw not her own reflection, but a terrifying and heartbreaking scene from the past. She saw Thomas, a young, handsome man, but his eyes were filled with a cold, possessive rage. He was standing in the very same room, yelling at a young woman who was crying, her face contorted in a silent scream of agony. It was Eliza. And then she saw him. Not the spectral, gaunt figure she was used to seeing, but a tall, emaciated man with a cold, hollow expression. She saw him standing behind Eliza, whispering in her ear, and as he did, she watched as Eliza's reflection in the mirror began to fade, a slow, terrifying process of spiritual consumption. The mirror was not just a portal to the past, it was a record of Thomas's crime. But there was a bizarre and macabre detail. In the mirror, Chloe saw not just Thomas and Eliza, but a third person. It was an unseen figure, a spectral presence that was standing behind Thomas, its hands on his shoulders, its eyes filled with a cold, malevolent energy. The figure was a physical manifestation of Thomas's jealousy and possessive rage, a spiritual parasite that had consumed him, and he was now passing it on to her. The unseen roommate wasn't just a ghost. He was a host, and she was his next victim. The chilling question now was, what was the true nature of the spiritual parasite? Was it a single entity, or was it a form of spiritual illness that was passed from one host to the next? And what would happen when she finally broke the mirror? When she finally severed her connection to Thomas in the spiritual antechamber? The chilling revelation of the spiritual parasite, the unseen entity that had consumed Thomas and was now trying to consume Chloe, had turned her terrifying battle into a desperate race for survival. The grandfather clock's pulsing red light was now a frantic, terrifying rhythm. The walls of the spiritual antechamber seemed to be closing in on her. This is the final, desperate climax of a real ghost story, where the protagonist, armed with nothing but their knowledge, must fight a ghost that is a part of them. Her research with Dr. Petrov, however, had given her a final, desperate bit of folklore about spiritual parasites. The doctor explained that these parasites, in their desperation to find a new host, will often try to possess the victim through their reflection, a symbolic act that would sever the victim's connection to their own soul. This chilling and unique detail was a terrifying new layer of the paranormal. It meant that the mirror was not just a portal, but a weapon that could be used against her. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman who, in the 19th century, had smashed a haunted mirror, but in doing so had also shattered her own reflection. A symbolic act that had freed her from the possession, but had also left her with a profound spiritual emptiness. The haunting, in its final terrifying act, began to manifest physically. The ghost of Thomas, his eyes filled with a cold, possessive rage, began to scream. Not with his voice, but with his mind. A low, guttural growl that was filled with a profound sense of fear and desperation. "Don't break it. Don't look at it. It will take me," he screamed, his voice a distorted, inhuman sound that was a direct reflection of his soul. He was not a possessive predator. He was a terrified victim, a host that was being consumed by a spiritual parasite. Chloe, in a final, desperate act of defiance, raised her hand, a small silver locket that she always wore around her neck, clutched tightly in her fist. The locket was her connection to the physical world, a symbol of her own life and her own identity. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, not at the skeletal figure of Thomas superimposed over her face, but at her own eyes, and she felt a wave of profound sadness and resolve. She knew that to defeat the parasite, she would have to sacrifice a part of herself. The chilling question now was, what would be the price of her freedom? Would she be able to defeat the parasite, or would she be consumed by it? And what would happen when she finally broke the mirror, when she finally shattered her own reflection and severed her connection to the spiritual antechamber? The shattering of the mirror was not a loud, jarring sound. It was a silent, internal implosion. The reflection of Thomas, the spectral parasite, and Chloe herself all dissolved into a million tiny, sparkling fragments of light, a silent, beautiful, and terrifying spectacle. The spiritual antechamber, which had been a terrifying reality for her, began to collapse, the walls dissolving into a cloud of dust and decay. The grandfather clock, its red glow fading, let out a final mournful chime, a sound of profound sadness and release. This is the cathartic and terrifying end of a haunted history where the protagonists, having faced their greatest fear, is finally free. Her research with Dr. Petrov had revealed the final and most terrifying bit of folklore about spiritual sacrifice. The doctor explained that when a person shatters their own reflection to defeat a spiritual parasite, they are also shattering a part of their own soul, leaving behind a spiritual wound that can never be healed. This chilling and unique detail was a terrifying new layer of the paranormal. It meant that her freedom had come at a great and personal cost. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman who, in her old age, was said to have a single, translucent eye, a permanent, spiritual mark of the ghost she had defeated. Chloe, having been returned to her apartment, felt a profound sense of emptiness. The grandfather clock was back in its place. Its hands stopped at 2:45, but the red glow was gone. The air was no longer cold and thick. It was filled with the scent of dust and a faint coppery temps. The phantom hunger and the coppery taste in her mouth were gone, but they had been replaced by a new, more profound feeling of spiritual hunger, a constant gnawing feeling of emptiness that no amount of food could fill. She was free from the haunting, but she had paid a terrible price. The final act of her torment was not a possession or a death. It was a profound spiritual emptiness. She was a survivor of a psychological battle she had won, but she was now a victim of a spiritual war she had lost. She was no longer a host to the unseen roommate, but she was now a part of him. A living ghost with a spiritual wound that would never heal. The chilling question now was, what would be the rest of her life? Would she ever be able to live a normal life again? Or would she be a permanent living ghost, a walking reminder of the terrifying unseen roommate? The silence that now filled Chloe's apartment was not the terrifying, suffocating silence of the haunting. It was the quiet, profound silence of a haunted history that had finally been laid to rest. The grandfather clock was a silent, inert object in the corner. Its hands stopped at 2:45, a permanent and chilling reminder of the battle she had won. The air was no longer thick with a malevolent energy. It was filled with the scent of dust and decay, the natural, benign decay of an old apartment. Chloe was free from the unseen roommate, but she had paid a great price for her freedom. She was now a living ghost, a walking reminder of the battle she had won. Her research with Dr. Petrov had revealed a chilling final detail about spiritual scars. The doctor explained that when a person shatters a spiritual mirror, they are also shattering a part of their own soul. A permanent spiritual wound that can never be healed. This bizarre and unique detail was a terrifying new layer of the paranormal. It meant that her freedom had come at a great and personal cost. The historical fact that Dr. Petrov referenced was a forgotten legend about a woman who in her old age was said to have a single, translucent eye, a permanent spiritual mark of the ghost she had defeated. Chloe was now a permanent living ghost. The spiritual hunger and the coppery taste in her mouth were gone, but they had been replaced by a profound spiritual emptiness, a constant, gnawing feeling of loneliness that no amount of human companionship could fill. She was a survivor of a psychological battle she had won, but she was now a victim of a spiritual war she had lost. She was no longer a host to the unseen roommate, but she was now a part of him, a living ghost with a spiritual wound that would never heal. She would spend the rest of her life in quiet contemplation, her memories of the haunting a constant, silent presence. And so, we leave Chloe in her quiet, lonely home. The hum of the fan, the ticking of her own heart, the gentle rain on the window pane, it's a silence she fought for, a peace she earned. But it's not the same silence she knew before. It's a silence with an echo, a quiet space that holds the memory of a possessive presence. A ghostly roommate who may be gone, but whose mark on her soul will never truly fade. The shadows in the corners of the room are just shadows, and the creaks in the floor are just the settling of an old house. But for Chloe, and for you, the chilling question will always remain, when you are truly alone in the dark and you hear a soft, unexplainable noise? Is it just your imagination, or is it a sign that you have a new, unseen roommate? Perhaps you'll never know for sure. And maybe, in the end, that's the most terrifying truth of all.